Host. It is Friday, December the 24th, or as I like to call it, Procrastination Day for all of you who haven't bought your gifts yet. I am your host, Jon Cohen, covering the news in our nation this week from sea to shining sea. Well, among many things, it's Oscar season. And tomorrow I will join my fellow Jewish tribesmen in that most time-honored of Christmas traditions. Yes, I'm talking about going to the movies and partaking in the most delectable of culinary cuisines, Chinese food. For me, as I'm sure is true for many of you, movies and cinema have been a big part of my life. In fact, the earliest memories I have are going to the movies with my parents and seeing Gremlins, which scared the absolute crap out of me, and Return of the Jedi. I've always been a Star Wars fan, and like most fans of my generation, I love the original trilogy, episodes 4, 5, and 6, but never really cared for the prequel trilogy, that is, episodes 1 through 3. I thought there was too much use of CGI. I thought the acting, even though I think Natalie Portman's a fantastic actress, the acting was wooden and the dialogue was just at times unbearable. But the one thing I do give George Lucas major credit for in the prequel trilogy was pretty good storytelling. If you've seen all the Star Wars films, this will be a refresh. If you haven't and maybe even hate Star Wars, you'll understand where I'm going with this in just a minute. So we have to go back to the beginning of episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And what we find is that the Galactic Republic, which is like the United Nations of all the planets and alien races in the galaxy, is in a dispute over the taxation of trade routes with this organization known as the Trade Federation. And this eventually precipitates what we see later in episodes 2 and 3 into a civil war between the Republic and this other belligerent organization called the Separatists. And the overarching theme throughout episodes 1 through 3 is that this conflict presents a clear and present danger to the Republic. And because this existential danger exists, more and more power must be given to the government, specifically to a senator by the name of Sheev Palpatine, who becomes the chancellor. And once he becomes chancellor, Chancellor Palpatine uses his power to build warships and an army until eventually in episode 3, he is named emperor and at that point rules with unlimited power. However, what we learn fairly early on in the trilogy is that Palpatine is actually the one behind the conflict. He is the puppet master pulling the strings who allows this war to go on and be drug out until he can consolidate power for himself. George Lucas, I believe, is trying to send us a message in this narrative, which is crisis creates control, and politicians, for the most part, are self-serving and want to cling on to power. Okay, so why open the program this week with Star Wars? Because life all too many times imitates art. And what we're seeing with COVID, and specifically the Omicron variant, is akin to this extension of crisis for the purpose of maintaining power. Now, a few things. Do I believe that COVID was intentionally created for the purposes of control? No, I do not. Do I believe Joe Biden is trying to become emperor? I hope not. I know the left wanted us to believe that Donald Trump was going to do such a thing, name himself king, but I don't believe Joe Biden has any imperial aspirations, and thank God, because that would make Hunter Biden the heir apparent, kind of a scary thought. What I do believe, however, is that extending the narrative of crisis, promulgating the doom and gloom of COVID, and promoting the continuous deleterious effects of the pandemic is precisely what Democrats and the media want for the purposes of control. When we say such things as this, though, when we talk about authoritarianism from the left in regard to COVID, Democrats go on a verbal assault of conservatives and say, look at them, spewing their conspiracy theories and delusions of persecution. All we're trying to do is end COVID. And therein lies the first of many problems. You cannot end COVID. One of the worst things a politician can do is overpromise and underdeliver. It might get them elected, but it will be the viper that eventually comes back and bites them in the tuchus. And it has come back to bite Joe Biden because, remember, when he was running for president, he said this.
I will take care of this. I will end this. I will make sure we have a plan.
But of course, we know he didn't end it. And no amount of planning can disrupt the effects of an endemic virus. I said from the beginning of the pandemic, once it was evident that COVID-19 was present in every corner of the globe, there was not a country on planet Earth safe from it. This virus will become endemic. It will be a regularly occurring disease that we will have to live with for a very long time, just like the flu or the common cold. But your scientific betters, your political elites have crafted a message that COVID can be defeated. And as long as the narrative of the left is we have to undergo these measures to end COVID, then the measures never end. And he who controls the implementation of the measures essentially controls everything. I've had people ask me, do you believe that these scientists like Fauci and public health officials really want to control people? And my response is they may not consciously want that level of control, but on a subconscious level, I think anyone who is consistently in the spotlight day in and day out begins to crave the attention. Self-importance is an intoxicating elixir. As I said last week, no one knew who Anthony Fauci or Rochelle Walensky or Francis Collins was before this, and now they're household names. Anthony Fauci has shrines dedicated to him, and Francis Collins is singing songs like he's Mr. Rogers. I mean, do we really need the director of the NIH to sing a pandemic version of Somewhere Over the Rainbow? Celebrity is addictive. And that celebrity made a lot of politicians notoriously famous as well. Remember a year ago how Andrew Cuomo walked on water as governor of New York, despite the fact that he killed all the old people in the state by shipping them back into nursing homes and then covered it up. He was writing books and making millions of dollars. Sadly, COVID has created the opportunity for a lot of people to become stars and a lot of people to maintain control over other people's lives. And now we have the Omicron variant. So let's reiterate the facts surrounding Omicron. According to CNBC, quote, the rapidly spreading Omicron variant is now the dominant COVID strain in the U.S., representing 73% of sequenced cases. It goes on to say, in some parts of the country, the share of Omicron cases is higher than the nationwide figure of 73%. The CDC estimates it makes up more than 90% of cases in portions of the Northwest, South, Southeast, and Northeast. But what we always hear about are the cases. What everyone should be asking is the all-important question of how many hospitalizations and how many deaths. One of the most frustrating aspects of data extrapolation throughout this entire pandemic has been trying to understand how many people are being hospitalized and how many have died and how old these patients are. You always hear about caseload, but you don't hear about hospitalization rate. And if we don't look at hospitalizations and death and age, then we can't striate the effects of the virus. The reason historically that we didn't worry about diseases like pneumonia is because pneumonia typically doesn't become deadly except for the elderly. But if you went out and you said, okay, this year 50,000 people will die from pneumonia, you would create a certain level of concern, maybe even panic throughout the general population, as opposed to saying pneumonia will kill 50,000 people over the age of 75. Well, then the elderly community is concerned and needs to be protected, but everyone else goes about their lives. By the way, this is what they did in, Scandinavian countries. Even Deidre McPhillips over at CNN reported in an article this week, quote, 1 in every 100 seniors in the United States has died of COVID-19, according to federal data. More than 3/4 of people who have died from COVID-19 were 65 or older, with at least 514,000 deaths in this age group since the start of the pandemic, according to data from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The latest data from the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that there are about 50.4 million total people in this age group in the U.S. COVID-19 has been especially deadly for people aged 75 and older. More than 1 in every 60 people in this age group have died of COVID-19, end of quote. This has been the case throughout much of the pandemic, that the elderly was the most at-risk demographic and were the ones we had to protect. Not young adults and certainly not children, because they weren't dying from it. But despite this data, you still have the LA Unified School District trying to impose vaccine mandates, and, Bill de Blasio in New York City saying everyone over 5 has to be vaccinated. The one-shoe-fits-all mentality has been the major impetus of fear that has been used during this pandemic, and it's just unscientific. So, let's look at the current numbers surrounding Omicron. According to the New York Times numbers, as of today, the number of COVID deaths in the United States seven-day running average is 1,656. Okay. If Omicron is now the dominant strain, as we read just a few moments ago, despite its increased transmission rate being 70 times more transmissible, its death rate is not as high. In fact, 2 months ago, when Delta was the primary strain in the U.S., there were 2,062 deaths, 7-day average. So we're under those numbers. Even in the United Kingdom, where panic about Omicron is running rampant, the 7-day average as of today is 112 deaths. 2 months ago, there were 143 deaths, 7-day average. So in the UK, the numbers are not as significant as Delta. South Africa, where the Omicron variant was discovered, 57 deaths, 7-day average. 2 months ago, 145 deaths. The data is showing unequivocally that Omicron is not as deadly. But they can't let it go. They just can't. There is something that we need to all understand at this point, okay? And we need to chisel it in stone and store it away for safekeeping to remind ourselves, because it is the fact that COVID surges will be an annual occurrence. Because again, COVID is here to stay. Every seasonal cycle where we migrate indoors to stay cool in the summer and migrate indoors to stay warm in the winter, COVID will spread. It will be the case this winter and the winter of next year and the winter of the year after that, and so forth and so on. So, what are we supposed to do? Shut down and wall ourselves off every time there's an uptick in COVID? Then we might as well be Franciscan monks living in a monastery in the Alps. The effects this is having on lives, and I don't just mean physically, I mean emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, is destroying people. The rate of suicide and depression, especially amongst our young people, has skyrocketed. And has anyone stopped for a second and wondered how our elderly are coping? Most of them are already segregated from the world, alone with no spouse or loved ones, forced to eke out a lonely existence in nursing homes and geriatric communities. But your public health overlords don't want it to end. And that's not just me saying it. Listen to Darth Sidious Fauci declare this week that we're going to have to wear masks on airplanes essentially forever.
Or we won't have to wear masks on airplanes?
I don't think so. I think when you're dealing with a closed space, even though the filtration is good, that you want to go that extra step when you have people. You get a flight from Washington to San Francisco, it's well over a 5-hour flight. Even though you have a good filtration system, I still believe that masks are a prudent thing to do and we should be doing it.
So we're going to have to wear masks forever. And by the way, notice what Fauci said. He said, you are going to want to wear masks. It's prudent to wear masks. That's not what the question was. Okay? It's not what people want. It's not what's prudent all the time. It's what the science and the data say. And the science and the data say that airplanes are not a vector of transmission. If they had been, then we would have either required vaccinations to fly a long time ago or closed down domestic air travel in the early stages of COVID-19. But this isn't about science anymore. Listen to me, folks. when a person tells you that you're going to have to do something forever and gives no scientific or data-backed explanation and uses words like you're going to want to do this or it's prudent to do this, then it's not about helping you, it's about controlling you. You may recall last week we reported Colorado Governor Jared Polis had declared in a press conference that COVID was over in his state. He wasn't going to impose mask mandates. And if unvaccinated people get sick, it's their own darn fault. And Democrats were gobsmacked that he dares say such a thing. Well, this week on Meet the Press, Chuck Todd invited Polis to come on the show and redeem himself. You know, you have to love it when a Democrat versus a Republican says something that is sacrilegious to the left's ideology. When a Republican does it, instant cancellation, castigation, Maoist struggle session. But when a Democrat does it, they're like, well, maybe he really didn't mean it. I mean, come on, guys. He's just confused. He's just confused. Nope. Jared Polis making it pretty clear this week on Meet the Press that he absolutely meant everything he said.
Are you having any second thoughts about the state intervening here temporarily, whether it's a mask mandate or something else?
You know, Chuck, we're 2 years into this thing, and I think it's really important that our leaders, whether they're governors, mayors, local influencers, lead with facts rather than fear. People just don't react well to this ongoing environment of fear for 2 years. Let's lead with the facts. Look, the science-driven information people need to keep themselves safe with the individual freedom and local control that we deserve. That's where we are at this point. We know how to stop this thing. Getting 3 doses of the vaccine is highly effective and all but negates any risk that you face. So we just need to make sure that people go out and do it.
And of course, he is 100% correct. The vaccinations are highly effective, and fear-mongering is not going to stop or help the situation at all. But, you know, Chuck Todd doesn't know what to say because it's like, I gave him a second chance and he still held to his guns. By the way, can someone please talk to Chuck Todd about his haircut? I mean, it's like Julius Caesar meets Bart Simpson. Polis is up for re-election next year. He's not going to continue on with this crap. And Democrats better start taking notes here because unless you're in California, where I swear Gavin Newsom could hike taxes to 80% and impose mask mandates until Halley's Comet returns and Californians would champion him as king of the universe. Other blue states are going to oust their Democrat governors if they don't scale back these asinine COVID restrictions. Even Kamala Harris, our esteemed vice president, getting in on the action of questioning the sacrosanct decrees of our scientific establishment this week.
To react to one thing, the vice president said in an interview on Friday, we didn't see Delta coming. I think most scientists did not, upon whose advice and direction we have relied. Didn't see Delta coming, we didn't see Omicron coming, and that's the nature of what this awful virus has been, which, as it turns out, has mutations and variants. Dr. Fauci, perhaps nobody could have seen the specific of Delta or Omicron, but did you not see variants coming, or did you?
Yeah, I did. And I think that the vice president's statement was taken a bit out of context. I believe she was referring to the fact that the extraordinary number of mutations and amino acid substitutions, particularly with Omicron, no one had expected it that much. But we were well prepared and expected that we were going to see variants. There's no doubt about that. But I believe that the vice president was referring to the fact, if you look at the number of mutations in Omicron, it's unprecedented. There are about 50 of them, 30 of them in the spike protein, and about 10 to 12 of them in the receptor binding domain. We've never seen anything like that before. So in that context, she was correct.
Oops. Yeah, Kamala Harris, Democratic Party favorite. And asking a legitimate question. I mean, didn't they see it coming? And then we get this just long, technical, scientific answer from Fauci. I mean, Fauci, my God, is such a Democratic establishment goon at this point. I mean, you've got Anthony Fauci running interference, trying to clean up the vice president's foot and mouth moment. Oh, that's not what she meant. That's not what she meant. Yeah. That's exactly what she meant. I mean, if you can't see the propagandish tendencies of this guy, then your neurons are just not firing in sequence. Not even the Democratic upper echelon can question the decision-making of Saint Anthony Fauci because he is the science. Remember, guys, he is the science. Jeez. Speaking of Democrats bucking the establishment, how about old Joe Manchin this week putting the kibosh on Build Back Better? So Joe Manchin had been telling his own party for months now that he wasn't going to vote for this legislation. And like Democrats all too many times do, they denied that anyone would dare rebut their esteemed bill from on high. Well, this is what Joe Manchin had to say this past Sunday.
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.
Just kidding. But major props to the late Rowdy Roddy Piper for that role. No, just kidding. That's probably what Joe Manchin wanted to say. But here's Senator Joe Manchin with Brett Baer over at Fox.
Actually, the way they are right now, I've always said this, Brett, if I can't go home and explain it to the people of West Virginia, I can't vote for it. And I cannot vote to continue with this piece of legislation. I just can't. I've tried everything humanly possible. I can't get there.
You're done. This is a no.
This is a no.
As you can imagine, the left's response was just absolutely vitriolic. Here is Bernie Sanders Stalin and his other comrades from the Democratic Party telling Joe Manchin that he's a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad person.
To the people of West Virginia why he doesn't have the guts to stand up to powerful special interests.
He is obstructing the president's agenda.
We are not going to let people play these games anymore because they are relying on norms of the old boys club.
But of course, it didn't stop there. Here's a mashup of members of your esteemed, impartial, right, bipartisan journalisming teams on various establishment networks. This is what they had to say, jumping in on the action.
Senator Manchin has just said that he is a firm no on this legislation.
Manchin is a mercurial person to be dealing with from people I've talked to within the White House. We know this to be true. And he, may want to be a kingmaker in some ways when it comes to this legislation.
This is Joe Manchin wanting to extend the Joe Manchin show, period.
Feeling the love from your establishment media, mercurial, the Joe Manchin show. Now, I'm no political strategist, but I'm pretty sure if you wanted to salvage any semblance of passing Build Back Broker, you ain't going to do it now since you've raked Joe Manchin over the coals. And speaking of coal, West Virginia is precisely why he's not doing this. One of the primordial behavioral characteristics of an intelligent being is self-preservation. Joe Manchin is a Democratic senator in what is probably the reddest state in the country. He is a political aberration for Democrats, a vestigial holdout from a bygone era of Southern Democrats who are basically all Republicans now. If he had voted for Build Back Better, then he is out next election cycle. He's out. But for people like Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar and AOC, who live in the bluest of the blue areas of our country, this isn't an issue. They could have voted for a $20 trillion bill, and their constituents would have said, well done, guys. You know what? We want you to go out and spend more. Please, spend more. We want higher taxes. But people like Joe Manchin have to live in the real world, because let me tell you, West Virginia is about as real as it gets. And by the way, there is a reason why this episode is entitled, There's a New Sheriff in Town, and his name is Joe Manchin. This was Joe Manchin's response to the harassment he received from his own party.
I knew where they were, and I knew what they could and could not do. They just never realized it because they figured, surely to God we can move one person. Surely we can badger and beat one person up. Surely we can get enough protesters to make that person uncomfortable enough. They'll just say, okay, I'll vote for anything, just quit. Well, guess what? I'm from West Virginia. I'm not from where they're from, and they can just beat the living crap out of people and think they'll be submissive.
You know what? Good for Joe Manchin. I mean, honestly, why are Democrats so shocked? Why? Manchin was never on board with this crap. He said as much and had been saying as much for months. He said 1.5 trillion was his cutoff. And then what really pushed him over the edge was when he found out from the Congressional Budget Office that this bill was going to cost more like $4.5 to $5 trillion. And he said, absolutely not. But this goes back to elitism. Democrats think they have all the answers about COVID, about foreign policy, about the economy, about what's best for your life in your remote corner of the country. And it doesn't matter if they know absolutely nothing about your state, nothing about your community. They're going to insert their magnanimous opinions of what's best for you. Here's the disgraceful Congresswoman Ilhan Omar explaining what's best for the people of West Virginia.
That Senator Manchin couldn't be trusted. The excuses that he just made, I think are a complete bull. It is really disheartening to hear him say that he has been trying to get there for the people of West Virginia, because that's a complete lie. There are just so many things that the people of West Virginia desperately need. And we know that he is not working on behalf of their interest.
I mean, the hubris of someone like Ilhan Omar, who honestly has probably never even been to West Virginia except driving through it, to lecture Joe Manchin on the people of his home state and what they need. But this goes back to what I've been talking about lately as one of the intrinsic problems surrounding the Democratic Party. They are snobs. They're snobs. They're entitled elites who have attitudes which are completely out of touch with vast swaths of the country, most specifically with white rural voters. And newsflash, white rural voters are precisely what makes up West Virginia. Democrat elites from urban centers, people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Ilhan Omar, believe they're better, and anyone who opposes them is an unperson, to quote Orwell. I mean, their culture, their philosophies, their way of life are just morally and socioeconomically superior. And if you're not on board with them, then you're beneath them. One of the reasons why conservatives like myself want decentralized power in government is for precisely what we're seeing here. Imperial capitals of old, like Rome and London, were so far removed from their outlying provinces and colonies that the intellectual and political elites who lived within these cities couldn't understand the plight of someone living in a place where there was no running water or limited access to food. Lack of understanding regarding provincial life is basically what precipitated the American Revolution. These aristocrats only knew what surrounded them, which in the case of Rome and London was essentially Elysium, the finest of everything. A Democratic congresswoman from Minneapolis doesn't know the first thing about what's best for a coal miner in Marshall County, West Virginia, and it's an insult for her to assume she does. But the Democratic mantra consists of one idea. If we don't like something, we tear it down. The path to passing Build Back Better was blocked by one senator from the 40th most populous state in the country and the poorest state in the country by per capita income. And this infuriates the left. It infuriates them because they see an institution, the United States Senate, which still exists, a place where every state, rich or poor, big or small, is on equal footing. And in accordance with their mantra, they want it torn down. And they're not even hiding the ball at this point. Here's the inestimable Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez explain to us how she wants to see the United States Senate destroyed.
Since the founding of the United States that are fundamentally undemocratic. The United States Senate is one such example. Now, we elect our senators by popular vote. That is a democratic part. That is a democratic function. There are some states, like, for example, in Georgia and in Texas, where the right to vote is under attack. And that is fundamentally undemocratic. But what makes the Senate, but that affects everybody and all seats. But what makes the Senate fundamentally undemocratic is that it gives small groups of people the same amount of power as massive groups of people. And that is not democratic at all.
Okay, so wait, I'm really confused. I was originally told that the Democratic talking point, the Democratic theology, the mantra was equity, equity, equity. And now you're telling me that if small groups of people have the same amount of power as big groups of people, that's undemocratic? Yeah. Are you feeling that the reason she is so vitriolic toward the United States Senate is because they didn't get their way with Joe Manchin? Right. We don't like it. We want to tear it down. And God, I don't know what's more annoying. Her voice or the fact that I have a bartender lecturing me on the institutional evils of the Senate. And how much do you want to bet? If she doesn't run for president, she'll run for Senate in New York. All Joe Biden had to do was embrace normalcy and moderate political viewpoints. This is what he ran on. This is what he was elected on. And I can't decide whether it's senility, delusions of grandeur, or flat out entrapment from radicals like AOC, maybe a combination of all three. But the direction he's gone in by making people like Bernie Sanders his wingman is the reason that he's not getting reelected in 3 years. At some point, out of a sense of self-preservation, like Joe Manchin, you would think he'd wake up from his mental slumber, if that's even possible, and realize his unpopularity is due to the friends he's keeping. But at this point, I think the corner he's painted himself into is one in which he cannot emerge. All right. I want to take a moment to talk about Coast to Coast. We are now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all major podcast apps. Please take a moment to check us out and click the follow button on those apps. You can also find us on the World Wide Web at coasttocoast.buzzsprout.com. That's COAST, the number 2, COAST.buzzsprout.com. So imagine for a moment that you're Santa Claus. And your next stop is the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, PA. You really want to deliver a pair of hop-along boots and a pistol that shoots to Barney and Ben, and dolls that'll talk and will go for a walk for Janice and Jen. But you're also afraid that in the process of delivering these wonderful toys, you'll be shot by a mugger. Therefore, you skip Philly and you move on to Scranton. Well, sadly, that is the reality in Philadelphia right now, which is just one example of the crime which is sweeping through our major cities. Fox News reporting. The Philadelphia district attorney is walking back comments made earlier in the week when he claimed that the city does not have a crime problem, despite homicides reaching a record number in 2021. Larry Krasner, the district attorney, denied that there has been a rise in violent crime during a Monday press conference and said residents should not be concerned with rising crime. Why should you be concerned with a thing like rising crime? It's like, it's like more rain. Come on, it's not that bad. We don't have a crisis of lawlessness, he said. We don't have a crisis of crime. We don't have a crisis of violence. The district attorney told reporters at a Monday press conference, quote, "It's important that we don't let this become mushy and bleed into the notion that there is some kind of big spike in crime. There isn't. There is not a big spike in crime. There is not a big spike in violent crime. Neither one of these things is true." Wrongo, it is true. In 2021, so far, the Philadelphia Police Department has reported 521 homicides. 521, which is a 13% increase compared to 2020, and the city's highest number of killings since at least 2007. NBC 10 in Philadelphia actually reports this is the highest since 1990. Incidents involving a shooting have also increased by 4.4%, and the number of people who are victims of a shooting has risen by almost 3% over the past year. On Wednesday, former Philadelphia Mayor Michael Nutter blasted Krasner's remarks in a Philadelphia Inquirer opinion piece and labeled them as some of the worst comments he's heard by an official. District Attorney Larry Krasner's recent remarks about whether we are experiencing a crime crisis are some of the worst, most ignorant, and most insulting comments I have ever heard spoken by an elected official, Nutter said. Nutter also said that Krasner's comments reek of quote-unquote white privilege and quote-unquote white wokeness. Quote, it takes a certain audacity of ignorance and white privilege to say that right now, Nutter said. I have to wonder what kind of messed up world of white wokeness Krasner is living in to have so little regard for human lives lost, many of them black and brown, while he advances his own national profile as progressive district attorney, end of quote. So just so you're aware, Michael Nutter is by no means of the word a conservative. He's a pretty leftist guy too. But it is just hilarity to watch the woke get eaten by people who are absolutely fed up with their condescending BS. And, you know, this week, even Mary Gay Scanlon, the Democrat congresswoman that represents part of South Philly, was carjacked at gunpoint in South Philadelphia. Isn't it fascinating? As we reported last week about San Francisco Mayor London Breed, that defund the police isn't such a popular slogan anymore. That electing leftist, progressive, if you want to even call them that, DAs like Larry Krasner is quite detrimental to the safety of major American cities. And conservatives have been saying for a while now, defunding the police, putting progressive political hacks like Krasner into office is going to disparately affect one group of people more than any other, and that group are black and brown citizens of inner cities. I know it's shocking to Democrats that black people in major urban areas want to be able to walk to the local store without fear of being robbed or shot. I know they're baffled by this concept. And now the chickens have come home to roost for these Democrat mayors and politicians that have been advocating this nonsense. There's an overarching theme that I really want everyone to take notice of as we go into the new year and as you look back at 2021 regarding Democrat verbiage. And I mean just recently, okay? A year ago, remember, it was defund the police, it was build back better, it was big government spending, COVID mandates and closures. These were the major talking points of the left. And every single one of those talking points has now shifted from radical to moderate for the vast majority of Democrats, except for people like AOC and the squad. Now it's, we want the police back. We can't afford to spend all this money without there being long-term effects on the American people. Americans should be able to get on with their lives and kids should be back in school. Have you noticed this pervasively more moderate theme becoming the mainstay now of Democrats? Do you think that's by accident? Do you think they've all suddenly had an epiphany? They're doing this for the simple reason that they don't want to lose power next year in the midterms or their next election cycle, whenever that may be. This was never about helping people. This was about power, plain and simple. And when you go to the polls next year, remember that. Remember, they were the ones who initially wanted all of these failed policies. They were the ones who pushed their moral elitist attitudes on all of you because in their minds, they're better than you and smarter than you. They were the ones who transformed your cities into dystopian hellholes. How long are you going to stay friends with someone who continually berates you and uses you for their own personal gain? I sincerely hope that conservatives and liberals and independents take heed of this duplicitous messaging that is being sent now. Don't vote for people who come around once every 2 or 4 years to your neighborhood and talk about how much they love you, and then you never see them again until the next election cycle. Vote for the person who cares not of power. Vote for the person who doesn't want to be a politician. But most importantly, vote for the person who looks at you as a person and not as a number through which they maintain office. Well, that's all we have for this week on Coast to Coast. I want to wish everyone a very happy and safe holiday. We'll be back next week with a look back at 2021 and some of the top stories that shaped our news this past year, and some other current news and events that are going on in our nation. I am Jon Cohen, and we will see you here next week on Coast to Coast, the